Hi, everybody. My name is Jeremy Crosmer, and I am a cellist in the DSO and a composer and arranger. I'm here today with a special guest, Grammy-nominated composer Anna Clyne. She was described as a composer of uncommon gifts and unusual methods by the New York Times, and the great conductor Riccardo Muti said that Anna writes from the heart, defies categorization, and reaches across all barriers and boundaries. I have to say personally, she is writing some of the most beautiful music out there today. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to be part of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra's upcoming concert.
Nice to meet you too. So let's jump right in. Tell us about your work being performed by the DSO titled Stride. It has a connection to Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, right?
It does. So it's a piece I wrote last year during the 2020 pandemic, and I was invited to find inspiration in Beethoven's music, and I had free range. And the piece that popped into my head was his iconic sonata Pathetique in C minor. And one of the things I love about that piece is in the very opening, he has these octaves that move pretty quickly, and it's this very funky kind of bass line. And it reminded me of stride piano playing, and I thought that would be a really fun element to riff on. So I chose to base this piece on Sonata Pathetique. The sonata is actually in three movements, but stride is in just one movement.
Mhm.
But it has three subsections, and what I did is I took a few ideas from the Beethoven from each movement and spun them out through my own lens. So sometimes it was a rhythmic idea, such as the very opening gesture. Sometimes it was these octave leaps, like I described at the beginning in the first movement. Sometimes spiraling out a melody from one of his kernels of a melodic idea or a harmonic progression. So it's sort of taking some kernels of Beethoven's music and spinning it through my own lens.
That's great. And so you picked Beethoven because why?
Oh, so last year was his 250th anniversary, and this piece was a co-commission between Scottish Chamber Orchestra, where I'm associate composer, Lausanne, and River Oaks Chamber Orchestra here in the US, and the Australian Chamber Orchestra. And it was specifically the Australian Chamber Orchestra that had invited me to find inspiration in Beethoven as part of their program that was specifically incorporating works inspired by Beethoven in some way as part of that lineage.
That's so great. And so this is actually part of a trilogy of works that you wrote that were inspired by Beethoven for his 250th anniversary. Can you tell us a little bit about the other two pieces?
Yeah, so the first piece that kicked off this trilogy was a piece called Breathing Statues, and it's a string quartet that I wrote for the Calidore Quartet. And similarly, I was invited to find inspiration in his late string quartets. So, as I explained with Stride, I had a similar approach. I listened to the B flat major Opus 13 quartet and the later Opus 16 F major quartet and the Grosse Fuga. And I found little elements that I then spun out through my own lens. And the idea of breathing actually came from a moment in the Grosse Fuga where you have all this energy and suddenly it stops and there's silence. And he has this shift from this E flat major chord to this C major chord, which just feels incredibly poignant. You feel the sort of release of the music, of the breathing of the music. So that was the initial point of departure. And then I found other musical gestures in the F major and B flat major that had that similar feeling of sighing or breathing, and also material that contrasted it with that sensation. So especially in the Grosse Fuga, as you'll know as a cellist, the sort of really driving energy, sort of spinning that. And that piece is called Breathing Statues, which is also from a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke called On Music. And the opening line is music, the breathing of statues, perhaps the silence of paintings, language where language ends. So this idea of music of breathing statues and thinking of the image of a string quartet sort of as a breathing, collective. So
Right. That's so interesting. Rilke is one of my favorite poets. I have his Letters to a Young Poet.
oh yeah,
Yeah, it's one of my favorite books.
yeah, his poetry is just, it's always an inspiration.
I saw that your is it your cello concerto that uses the poem from Rumi?
It does, yeah, very short poem, Dance. The cello concerto is also called Dance, and each line of those of of the 5-line poem by Rumi, it begins with the word dance. So the poem is dance when you're broken open, dance when you've torn the bandage off, dance in the middle of the fighting, dance in your blood, dance when you're perfectly free, which was a great structural device too for the cello concerto. But I'm often inspired by poetry in my music.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful poem. I actually listened to your cello concerto online, and if anyone's interested, you can go to Anna's website at annaclyne.com. There's so many different recordings and scores that you can listen to, and the cello concerto is so beautiful. I hope that I get a chance to play it someday.
Thank you. I hope so too. That'd be great.
Getting back to Stride, I understand that you have a few musical examples that you can show us about the connection between Stride and Beethoven.
Yeah, so just before I jump in and show you, I'll show you how that, for example, that left hand striding piano is incorporated into the strings. I should add a side note. This is quite a challenging piece. I'm really excited that the DSO is taking it on. Like you would think that octave leaps would be quite idiosyncratic for the strings, but they can be pretty gnarly to move around. So
Yeah, that's true. We have a great string section of the DSO, so I'm sure they're looking forward to it.
yeah, definitely. But my background is also in electroacoustic music. So sometimes I like when I'm writing acoustic music, is I like to use orchestration to create sonorities that I would with electroacoustic music. And one very obvious example is reverberation,
Mhm.
um, and which is very easy in Pro Tools or as an audio editing stuff where you just add the plug-in and you get this beautiful cathedral-like space or a chamber music room. But what you can do is, for example, if you have a melody, you can have different instruments sustaining the pitches. So I can show you an example of that, which I do when there's more melodic material in the piece. But yeah,
Okay.
why don't I jump in and show you the score here? On the left here, you'll see the measures 11 to 19 of the Pathetique Sonata, and you can see here this sort of striding piano line that really nails down the tonic there, and then it gradually creeps up with this sort of chromatic-like motion, which is set against these descending chords. So this sort of contrary motion is also something that influences my piece. So then if we go across the page here, you'll see here in measure 10 in the cello, they have these octave leaps that are punched out with the bass playing an octave lower to show that scale movement there. And then after 2 measures of that, you have the cello and the bass doing this ascending bass line in octave unison with the offbeats and the violins and the violin 2 and viola, so you're still getting the feeling of that sort of displaced octave movement and then back. And then this is something that I continue to develop, going back a little bit at the very beginning, sort of similar to what we were talking about with breathing statues, thinking of the ensemble as a sort of breathing body of sound. So it starts with this up bow. I always think of up bows as feeling a bit like an inhalation too, especially if it's coming from niente, which is nothing. I write N here. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see the cello and the viola have this sort of contrary motion that I spoke about, and then the pizzicato sort of stops them, and they're moving from non-vibrato to poco vibrato. So I tend to put a lot of detail in my music about how the notes are played, not just what the notes are themselves.
I do love the attention to detail. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is that you have this Beethoven excerpt in your score, which is really useful for performers because as performers, sometimes we are wondering about the inspiration behind composers, and to have it right there in front of us, it really helps us out a lot. So that's great.
There's an appendix at the end too, so that also it sort of explicitly shows like this rhythmic gesture that I use, which is actually the very opening of the Beethoven, and this we've looked at already. Some of these more melodic ideas. So if someone has some time on their hands, they could look at these and find how I've spun them out through my own lens. But I think
Right, and you have quotes from all three movements, and you
yeah,
said your piece is just one movement, but with three sections in it.
yeah, exactly. The very last element that I incorporate into Stride here, the 3 last measures of the rondo allegro in the third movement. If you can see that there, if I take you to the end of Stride, I just speed it up. If I zoom in there, you can see where it's
Oh yeah, in the violin part, a lot more notes.
a lot more notes, a lot faster, and with a lot more aggression. So, but taking that same sort of cascading figure, which is in opposition to that opening striding piano figure, which is ascending in pitch. So,
Wow. And how often do people write 5 Fs in their music? I
right,
see that at the very last note ends with 5 Fs.
yes, so pretty much at the threshold of loudness.
We'll try not to break our instruments. And do you have some recordings that you can play for us?
I do, yes. For example, so there you heard the striding piano, and I could play you a few other excerpts that are incorporated into stride to perhaps hear a moment from the second movement, bars 17 to 22. So you hear that melody. I cut it off a little short, but it's a sort of two-phrase melody, and I take the first phrase and then expand it. So you'll hear that as a soaring melody in the violins against a quite turbulent lower string writing. And if I show you another example from the third movement, for example. So very characteristic rhythm to it. And I slow that down and make it into a sort of lilting jig later on in the piece. So just an example of some elements from the Beethoven that I then develop through my own music.
That's so great. That it's nice to be able to hear those examples and see the music on the page. I had one question about your score, which I've always been curious about as a composer, and I'm sure listeners are curious. Your tempo markings are in English, and you use words like curiously um, and proudly and stately, and instead of allegro moderato or andante. And so, what's the reasoning behind that?
It's sort of, when I'm composing, it comes in different stages, and actually the addition of these adjectives or descriptive text, it comes at the end, and I find it's a way to very quickly get a sense to the conductor and the musicians of the kind of the mood or the tone of the music. So perhaps like an allegro gives a sort of feeling of the spirit or the tempo of a piece, but I write very specific tempo marks too.
Hmm.
And then, I feel like I forget what the opening is. It curiously, I forget what
Yeah,
the opening is.
curiously.
Right. Yeah. So this little breath that has a little more hesitancy than perhaps if I were to just write a nondescript text.
Yeah, it's a little bit more informative, and it's in
Yeah.
a language we don't have to you pull out our Mahler translator. I don't know if our listeners know this, but musicians have a handbook for whenever we play scores by Mahler because there's so much German in it, and for a lot of us, that's not our native language. So it's nice to see words that are very descriptive. I want to switch gears now and talk about a special piece of technology that you've had shipped to us this week to aid in our rehearsals. So at the DSO, when we perform new pieces, we typically like to invite the composer to attend rehearsals and give feedback. But unfortunately, that's been really difficult during the pandemic. So tell us about the invention that you and your husband, Jody Elf, have come up with, Ted the Head.
Yes, Ted the Head has sort of been my second self during the pandemic. As you mentioned, it's impossible to be present unless it's a very small social distance ensemble to be present to travel and be present at these rehearsals. And when it's a new piece, it's really kind of essential that you're there, because it's like a new piece is a work in progress. You want to tweak this, adjust the balance there. Um, and I know you can interact with things like Zoom and Skype platforms, but the challenge with that is the fidelity of the sound. It doesn't represent the piece or the space to a degree that you can really make effective revisions and so forth. So yes, Jody, my husband, has created Ted the Head, which is a binaural head. He's taken an anatomically correct plastic head and put very high fidelity microphones in the ears and a 360 camera. And Ted the Head travels from our home here in New York to various venues, and in a travel case with a Ted the Head, the camera, and a mini Mac Mini computer and some cables, and is plugged in to Wi-Fi at the venue. And it's really incredible. I, here at my home, put on some high fidelity headphones and some virtual reality glasses, and I'm able to see the space and hear it with incredible precision, and it really feels like you're in the space. It's quite extraordinary. When we first were developing it, we had Ted the Head out in our garage, and I put on the headphones. You could hear the leaves rustling. You really get that sense of the 363-dimensional sonic experience. So Ted the Head's been instrumental in our rehearsals for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and whilst I can't be there in person, it's sort of the next best thing to recreate that experience of physically being in the hall present with the musicians.
That's such an incredible piece of technology. How long did it take to develop or work through?
Well, Jodie's been doing a lot of development of technology, remote recording and remote audio as part of this past year in the pandemic. So I think it's something he's been thinking about a lot, because it also has implications on bringing concert goers to a hall where they might not ordinarily be able to go. So it opens up lots of potential for regular concert goers, around the world. You could potentially come and see this concert with Google Cardboard or some kind of VR experience and really feel like you're in the space. So
Right.
yeah, the pandemic was the year for developing these technologies.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, our listeners know that being at our concert hall in person is immeasurably better than listening to music on the radio or Zoom or hearing a CD. But it sounds like this TED the Head gives you a 360-degree sonic experience. It's like actually being in the hall. Do you think that at some point this could be something that audience members may use if they are stuck at home?
Absolutely, that's the hope. I mean, as you said, nothing fully recreates the experience of being in a concert hall. But I do think this is the nearest thing to that experience. The ears on the binaural head are very human-like, so you get this sort of reflection into the microphones. So it's quite an extraordinarily realistic experience that hopefully has the potential to bring concert goers back into the hall during this period of time where we might not be able to be there.
Wow. And so, what is the interaction like between you and the orchestra when you're using TED? Like, what sorts of changes are you able to make from afar?
Yeah, I should have mentioned it. In addition to the binaural head and the 360 camera, there's also a speaker. So I'm able to speak back to the conductor and the musicians in real time as well. So they can hear me and I can hear them. So because of the very high fidelity sound, I'm able to make very subtle adjustments, like with balance, if I want to hear more basses, or perhaps the violas should come out in this section. But also hearing that, like in stride, there's lots of different textures. So we have pizzicato, or playing near the bridge, a sol ponticello that gives it a more glittery sound. If I want to hear more of that or less of that, and then obviously bigger picture elements like tempi, how fast a passage is going, how loud it is. Those elements, I feel like I'm right there in the space and can have a dialogue with the conductor to make those adjustments in real time.
That's so nice. And just as an aside, some of the compositions that we've played this year, we've had a computer out in the audience, and somehow the audio from our 4,000K or whatever speakers is transferred to the composer in their living room, and then they call the stage manager on the cell phone to give the comments, and then the stage manager goes to the conductor and tells them what the composer wants to change. It's been really strange. So using this technology is going to be really great for us.
Yeah, it's really, really exciting for us as well.